Tonight, we are honored to have Rick Atkinson speak here. Rick is the best-selling author of the Liberation Trilogy, An Army at Dawn, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, The Day of Battle, and Guns at Last Light, as well as The Long Gray Line and other books. His many awards include a Pulitzer Prize for Journalism, the George Polk Award, and the Pritzker Military Library Literary Award. A former staff writer and senior editor at the Washington Post, he lives in Washington, D.C. Rick has spoken here at our museum a few times. We're so glad to welcome him back. After the program, we'll do some question and answer. Then we'll do, Rick will be available to sign books. And I do want to address that we have a advertisement in the back, if you have not received it, that announces our upcoming program. So I hope you'll join us for our future events. And without further ado, Rick.
Thank you, Galen. Good evening. Thanks for having me back to Cantigny this beautiful evening. This is a place that takes its history seriously, and it's been a welcoming venue for serious books on military history. A great museum like this can really act as a time machine. It can transport us to distant places, faraway places, distant eras, and we'll use this setting to do exactly that this evening for a few minutes, traveling to a place and time of bitter partisan rancor, uncertainty about the present, deep anxiety about the future, and savage political discord. And I don't mean we're going to Washington, D.C. tonight. The last time I was here, I had just finished the third and final volume of the Liberation Trilogy, about the role of the American military in the liberation of Europe in World War II, a project that took me 15 years. And even before that final volume came out, I was pondering what to do next. I kept thinking of Jack London's advice that rather than sit back and wait for inspiration, a writer ought to light out after it with a club. And the obvious thing for me would have been to pivot to the Pacific and do for that theater what I had done for the Mediterranean and Western European theaters in World War II. But that would have required me to start World War II all over again at Pearl Harbor or even earlier, and that didn't have much appeal. And besides, I couldn't shake a personal fascination that I've had since I was a kid with an earlier century and an earlier war, so I took my club and I set out after it. So I've now completed the first volume of what I hope, knock wood, will be another trilogy. The British Are Coming opens with an extended prologue in June 1773 when King George III travels to Portsmouth on the southern coast of England for a 4-day review of the Royal Navy. It's a proud, fantastic display of military muscle precisely a decade after the creation of the first British Empire with Britain's victory over France and Spain in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War as we call it. 1773 is the year the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire" was coined. And this book ends with the two battles of Trenton and then the Battle of Princeton in early January 1777, which together resuscitated American hopes that had seemed all but extinguished at that point. Let me suggest that there is a lot to dislike about the Founding Fathers and the war they waged for American independence. The stirring assertion that all men are created equal did not, of course, apply to 500,000 black slaves, 1 in 5 of all souls who lived in the 13 colonies when those fine words were written in 1776. Nor was it valid for Native Americans, for women, or for indigents. For the 8-year duration of the American Revolution, those who remained loyal to the British Crown and even fence straddlers uncertain of the wisdom of armed rebellion against their government often were subjected to dreadful treatment, public shaming, disenfranchisement, confiscation, beatings, torture, exile, and sometimes execution. Some were imprisoned on Hudson River scows anchored below Normandy, or they were lowered by windlass 70 feet below ground in abandoned Connecticut copper mines to rock-walled cells known simply as hell. Partisan belligerence metastasized into civil war. John Adams said, "I would have hanged my own brother had he taken part with our enemies in the contest." Conformity, censorship, and zealotry flourished. In a defensive war waged for liberty and basic human rights, the Americans immediately invaded Canada in an effort to win by force of arms what could not be won by blandishment and negotiation, a 14th colony. This was the first, but hardly the last, American invasion of a foreign country on the pretext of bettering life for the invaded. The enduring image of a yeoman farmer leaving his plow in the furrow to grab his musket in defense of liberty is mostly mythical. General George Washington rarely had more than 20,000 soldiers, and sometimes his army was as small as 3,000, this in a country of 2.5 million people. Especially after the initial martial enthusiasm aroused at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill faded in 1775, relatively few American men volunteered for military service, particularly if it involved volunteering for the duration in the badly armed, badly fed, badly clothed, and often badly led American Continental Army. And yet, who would deny that the creation story of our founding remains valid, vivid, and often thrilling? Even in 2019, at a moment when national unity is elusive, when our partisan rancor is ever more toxic, when the simple concept of truth is assailed, that story informs who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and perhaps the most profound question that any people can ask themselves, what they were willing to die for. Indeed, at least 25,000 Americans died for the cause, and perhaps many more. It's a larger proportion of our population to die in any of our wars other than the Civil War. So what can we learn from that ancient quarrel? First, that this nation was born bickering. Disputation is in the national genome. Second, that there are foundational truths that not only are indeed true, but are, as the Declaration of Independence tells us, self-evident. Third, that leaders worthy of our enduring admiration rise to the occasion with grit and wisdom and grace. And fourth, that whatever trials beset us today, we have overcome greater perils, existential perils, in the past. That should be of great comfort. We're the beneficiaries of an enlightened political heritage handed down to us from that revolutionary generation after many subsequent struggles. It includes strictures on how to divide power and to keep it from concentrating in the hands of those who think primarily of themselves. We cannot allow that heritage to slip away. We cannot permit it to be taken away. We cannot be oblivious to this priceless gift or to the hundreds of thousands who over the past 240 years have given their lives to affirm and sustain it. Now, the American Revolution was not a war between dynasties or regimes fought for territory or the usual commercial advantages, but rather it was a struggle between two peoples of a common heritage who had been gradually sundered by divergent values and conflicting visions of what the world could become. The Americans eventually won by embracing fewer strategic misconceptions than the British did. Now, certainly the rebels, let's say us, could be wrong-headed about, for example, believing they had greater economic leverage over the mother country than they actually possessed, or in caricaturing George III, who sat on his throne for 60 years and was shrewder, more complex, and more admirable than the overbearing ninny who dominates our imaginations to this day, and even tonight is mincing across the stage somewhere in Hamilton. Yet George and his ministers made three critical miscalculations. First, that most colonists remained loyal to the crown, notwithstanding troublemakers in New England capable of rousing a rabble. Two, that firmness, including military firepower, would intimidate the obstreperous and restore harmony. And three, that failure to reassert London's authority in America would eventually unstitch the newly created British Empire, encouraging insurrections in Canada, Ireland, the Sugar Islands of the West Indies, India. It's an 18th century version of the domino theory that would propel us into Vietnam more than 150 years later. Britain also underestimated the difficulty of waging a protracted war across 3,000 miles of ocean in the age of sail, for 8 years as it turned out. Expeditionary warfare, whether waged in North America in the 18th century or in Central Asia in the 21st century, is among the most difficult of martial enterprises. The British Army in the Revolution, unable to venture into the American countryside for food and forage without being ambushed, relied largely on provisions shipped from British and Irish ports. But of 40 transport vessels dispatched across the Atlantic in the winter of 1775-76, only 8 of those 40 ships arrived directly in Boston. The rest were blown by gales back to Britain or blown to the West Indies or were intercepted by rebel marauders. Of 550 Lincolnshire sheep that actually arrived in Boston on ships that made it to Boston, and that breed was deemed the fittest to undergo the rigors of transatlantic travel. Of those 550 sheep, only 40 arrived alive. Of 290 hogs shipped, only 74 arrived alive. When the British moved to New York in the summer of 1776 and asked for 950 horses in order to pull their artillery carriages and their supply wagons so that they could move anywhere, of the 950 horses that were then shipped from Britain, 412 died in the passage across the Atlantic. Scores more were ruined beyond use, even though they arrived alive in New York. Similar difficulties plagued the British for years. Logistics is always hard in war. I've personally seen just how hard in Somalia and Bosnia and Iraq and Afghanistan. Even when the Americans were fighting on their home turf in the Revolution, they faced enormous difficulties. Of 75 official letters that General Washington wrote in January and February 1776, more than half mention munition shortages, often in pleading, fretful terms, especially gunpowder, which he just called the thing. It's difficult to make musket balls without lead. By the summer of 1776, the Americans were desperately short of this stuff. In New York, more than 100 tons of lead weights from fishing nets and clocks and window sash cords were collected to make bullets, along with lead from downspouts and window cames and pewter dishes. Without salt, armies and navies couldn't stockpile the meat and fish needed to move. And more than 2 bushels of salt, that's 100 pounds or more, were needed to cure 1,000 pounds of pork. Before the war, Americans had imported 15 million bushels of salt, half from the West Indies and half from Britain and Southern Europe. But when the shooting started, the British trade embargo strangled 2/3 of that supply. To encourage salt works along the Atlantic seaboard, recipes were printed in newspapers on how to make salt. To encourage salt works along the coast, bounties were offered. All the old women and children are gone down to the Jersey shore to make salt, John Adams wrote. But 400 gallons of seawater are needed to boil off a bushel of salt, and that takes huge stacks of firewood. Virginia spent more than 6,000 pounds, that's a very large sum of money in those days, to build evaporation ponds along the Chesapeake Bay. But in the end, they collected only 50 bushels. It's probably the most expensive salt in the history of salt. Yet those problems, substantial as they were, hardly matched Britain's problems. The 1,000 tons of bread needed to feed British soldiers in New York each month often arrived from depots in Cork on the southern coast of Ireland, moldy and infested with Irish rats. And there's no rat as nasty as an Irish rat. And those rats soon infested British storehouses on Staten Island. For the winter of 1776-77, the British needed 64,000 cords of firewood, 70 tons of candles. The daily allowance of a gill of rum for each redcoat. A gill was 5 ounces. It's about a gallon a month, which gives you an idea of inebriation problems in the British Army. That rum took an enormous amount of shipping space. The British Navy Board needed 400 transports and victualling ships to move and supply the large force in New York. It was triple the tonnage needed in the 7 Years' War, which was a global war. Let me talk for a moment about George, our last king. He's an intriguing adversary. Queen Elizabeth II only recently opened up to outside scrutiny the Georgian papers, which she owns, as part of a project to catalog and digitize the papers of all 4 Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are 350,000 pages, mostly from the reign of George III and mostly previously unpublished. And I was among the first allowed to take a look for a whole month in April 2016 at Windsor Castle, where the papers are stored just west of London. Every morning I would show my badge at the Henry VIII gate to get into the castle and show it again at the Norman gate, and then I would climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers in gorgeous, oversized red binders. George was his own secretary until late in life, when he began to go blind. And he wrote not only most of his correspondence himself, he made the copies himself. And as you paw through these pages, there's a tactile sense of being in his presence. Among other things, he was a great list maker. Lists of British garrisons abroad from 1764 to 1775. Lists of Royal Navy vessels under construction in various shipyards. Lists of all his regiments in America with the number of officers, rank and file, and musicians in columns with his arithmetic scratchings in the margin where he does his sums. George copied out his own recipes for cough syrup. Rosemary, rice, vinegar, brown sugar, all boiled in silver. Recipes for insecticide. Wormwood, vinegar, lime, swine's fat, quicksilver. He was interested in everything from music and astronomy to horology, the study of time, and the use of manures in agronomy. He married an obscure, drab German princess, Charlotte, as in Charlotte, North Carolina, Charlottesville, Virginia. She learned to play God Save the King on the harpsichord on the voyage from Germany to Britain. They married 6 hours after they met, and George had the marriage bedroom decorated with 700 yards of blue damask and large basins of goldfish, because nothing says I love you like a bowl of goldfish. The happy union proved fertile. She produced children with lunar regularity, eventually to number 15. And we see in his personal correspondence that George is a caring father. He's invested in the rearing of his kids. And through all this, he's trying to figure out the proper course for the British Empire, for the monarchy, and for his people. He's easy enough to dislike, but impossible, I find, to detest or simply to dismiss as a reactionary autocrat. The war he chooses to wage, and he chooses to wage the war because he is the hardest of the hardliners in London. That war is brutal, bloody, and often savage. Unlike modern war, killing in the 18th century is usually intimate. It's at very close range, often with a bayonet. And that's partly because 18th century muskets were largely inaccurate beyond 80 yards and mostly hopeless beyond 100 yards. Scholars have calculated that in the fights at Lexington, Concord, and the British retreat to Boston on the first day of the war, April 19th, 1775, the Americans fired about 75,000 rounds, but only 1 in every 300 actually hit a redcoat. The shot heard round the world probably missed. Battlefield wisdom held that it took a man's weight in bullets to kill him in the 19th century, and in the 18th century, and in the American Revolution. That's not far wrong. On the other hand, massed musket fire, clusters of men firing in volleys, sending swarms of 1-ounce lead slugs downrange at 1,000 feet a second, that could be devastating. A man 5 feet 8 inches tall, a little shorter than I am, had an exterior surface of 2,550 square inches, of which 1,000 square inches are exposed to gunfire when he's facing an enemy frontally at close range. Given the primitive inadequacy of 18th century medicine, which is hardly worthy of the name, if you're hit in the torso, you have more than a 50% chance of dying. If you're hit in the head, your chances of survival are even less. By the way, later studies by the British Army demonstrated that soldiers wearing conspicuous red uniforms were more than twice as likely to be shot in combat as those wearing muted blues and grays. Duh. American marksmen, particularly those few with rifles, which were more accurate than muskets but were harder to load and couldn't carry a bayonet, those marksmen tended to target the brightest of the red coats, those that were almost vermilion in hue, because they were usually worn by officers who could afford the more expensive dyes that made those coats pop. It was like having a sign on your uniform that said, "Shoot me." In the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, the British won about a square mile of rebel-held territory at a cost of over 1,000 casualties, including 226 British dead. Now, the British are coming is not something Paul Revere cried as he rode through the Middlesex countryside on the early morning of April 19, 1775. That wouldn't have made sense to people who at that moment still thought of themselves as British. What he's quoted as crying over and over again during that famous ride is, "The regulars are coming out," meaning the regular British Army coming out of Boston. But I use "the British are coming" as a title because it's a metaphor for what those first couple years of the war are really about. The British are coming relentlessly. They're coming with more than half of their ferocious professional army, with almost half of the greatest navy the world has ever seen, with 30,000 German mercenaries, the Hessians, and they're coming to kill your men, rape your women, plunder your homes, and in some cases burn your towns to ashes. It's a dire thing. Well, those are some of the nuts and bolts of 18th century warfare. But what of the emotional guts of the revolution? That's what still moves us and stirs our pride, makes us feel that those people of more than a dozen generations ago have something to say to us. Why is that? Certainly that revolutionary generation can seem so distant as to be almost a foreign people. If irony and skepticism are the twin lenses of modern consciousness, those revolutionaries often seem archaic. They're much less ironic and skeptical than their 21st century descendants. They speak English, of course, but they have their own idiom, their own argot, their own slang. For example, passing counterfeit money, widely practiced in the 18th century, was known as shoving the queer. Someone who died took heaven by the way. British soldiers in Boston, incidentally, often referred to Americans derisively as Jonathans. But those are minor differences. We rightly admire those Americans for their endurance, pertinacity, and sacrifice, not only by men serving in the ranks, but by others swept up in the fraught events of those times. Lois Peters of Connecticut hadn't seen her husband, Captain Nathan Peters, in months when she wrote to him, "Pray come home as soon as possible. A visit from you at any time would be agreeable." Meanwhile, she would harvest the corn, sell their oxen for enough cash to try to keep the family saddlery solvent, sew him a shirt, and take great pleasure doing it, she told him, and keep faith with the future. She signed her letters, "Your loving wife until dead." General Nathaniel Greene, a Quaker anchor smith from Rhode Island, makes one of the worst operational decisions of the war by leaving 3,000 American troops exposed and vulnerable at Fort Washington on Manhattan Island, where in the space of 8 hours on November 16, 1776, they're trapped and killed or captured. This is at a time during a period when American generalship is often characterized by miscalculation, misfortune, imprudence, and deficient military skill. But Greene picks himself up, he takes a deep breath, and he writes to Cati, his wife, "The virtue of the Americans is put to a trial. I am hearty and well amidst all the fatigues and hardships. Be of good courage. Don't be distressed. All things will turn out for the best." Be of good courage. He's speaking to us, to you and to you. He's certainly speaking to me. The sheer drama of the revolution keeps it compelling and often thrilling. From the bloodletting at Bunker Hill, where 1 in every 8 British officers killed in the Long War die in 4 hours, to the skin of the teeth escape by Washington and his army across the East River in the fog in late August 1776 after a terrible drubbing on Long Island. Beyond the battlefield, the theatrical power and pathos of the revolution outruns any dramatist's imagination. The abrupt arrival of the septuagenarian Benjamin Franklin in Paris in December 1776 to woo the French absolute monarchy into an alliance with radical Republicans. The 100,000 smallpox deaths in North America from 1775 to 1782. Those white men sitting in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, lashing at horseflies with their handkerchiefs while carving up Thomas Jefferson's draft declaration to make it shorter and much better. The many American families, Franklin's among them, torn apart, ripped apart by irreconcilable political differences. Now, if the central figures in our creation myth have often been embalmed in reverence, they nonetheless remain beguiling. They're worthy of perpetual scrutiny and often of emulation. Washington is a case in point. Yes, he owned more than 300 slaves when he died at Mount Vernon in 1799. You cannot square that circle morally. He demonstrated shortcomings as a tactical commander in Long Island, Fort Washington, and on other battlefields. The man who proverbially could never tell a lie sure could prevaricate. Washington's carping about his troops, his officers, his lot in life. "I distrust everything," he wrote in 1776, transforms the demigod into a sometimes petulant mortal. Yet great responsibility enlarges him. He rightly embodies the sacrifice of personal interests to a greater good, as well as other Republican virtues, small r, probity, dignity, moral stamina, incorruptibility. Traits that should remain true north for every citizen today, traits we should demand in our leaders at all levels. Now, the first couple of years of the Revolution that I describe in this book certainly brought bitter lessons for Washington that will be familiar to some of you who've been in the military. That war was rarely linear, preferring a path of fits and starts, ups and downs, triumphs and cataclysms. That only battle could reveal those with the necessary dark heart for killing, for years of killing. That only those with the requisite stamina, aptitude, and luck, the trait Napoleon most cherished in his generals, only those would be able to see it through. And finally, the hardest of hard truths in 1776, that for a new nation to live, young men must die. Often alone, usually in pain, and sometimes to no obvious purpose. Washington, more than anyone else, would be responsible for ordering those men to their deaths. His faith gave others faith. His strength made others strong. As commanding general of the Continental Army, the indispensable man leading the indispensable institution, he also demonstrated a shrewd understanding of the refractory independent peoples known collectively as Americans. Washington wrote in 1777, "A people unused to restraint must be led. They will not be drove." He was a leader. Well, lesser personalities, largely lost to history, speak to Americans in the 21st century of constancy and an antique patriotism. "Heaven only knows what may be my fate," Captain John McPherson wrote to his father in a last letter before he was killed at Quebec. "I experience no reluctance in this cause to venture a life which I consider is only lent to be used when my country demands it." Likewise, Lieutenant Samuel Cooper wrote to his wife, "The dangers we are to encounter I know not, but it shall never be said to my children, 'Your father was a coward.'" He too died at Quebec. Even Benedict Arnold, perhaps the finest battle captain on either side in the first couple years of the war, before his subsequent issues, wrote after being shot in the leg in Canada, "I am in the way of duty, and I know no fear." Some years ago, the distinguished historian John Shaw, who taught at the University of Michigan for eons, wrote that the Civil War, like every other major event in American history, including the Second World War, has a tragic, human, two-sided dimension that the Revolution seems to lack. The whole complex of revolutionary events takes on a smooth, self-contained character that makes getting the right emotional grip on the subject very difficult. My premise is that the bedrock of every war is tragedy, because every war is about young men and sometimes now young women dying young. My ambition has been to find that emotional grip, as Professor Shai put it, to revive the tragic human multi-sided dimension that permeates the American saga from 1775 to 1783. So we see Lieutenant Edward Hull, a young Scottish officer in the 43rd Regiment of Foot, shot at North Bridge in Concord, then shot again during the British retreat to Boston, captured by the Americans, in agony from 3 bullet wounds, sucking on an orange donated by a compassionate rebel. He lingers for nearly 2 weeks in a twilight of pain and remorse, and then he too takes heaven by the way. Or we see Mary Pierce, the widow of a private killed at Bunker Hill while fighting with the Massachusetts militia, as she petitions the Commonwealth for precisely £5 and 12 shillings in compensation for his lost coat, trousers, stockings, shoes, buckles, silk handkerchief, knife, and tobacco box. Or General Richard Montgomery, in the assault on Quebec as the commander, hit by grape shot through both thighs and mortally through the face. His effects were auctioned off to his officers a couple days after his death, item by item. 2 volumes of Polybius, Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, a buffalo skin and clothes brush bought by Captain Aaron Burr, and a wardrobe that included ruffled shirts, Holland waistcoats, and a pair of tea-tongs, all bought by Benedict Arnold. Or we see Île aux Noix, the island of nuts. It's a couple hundred acres in the Richelieu River, just above the New York border, where thousands of American soldiers retreating from Canada in June 1776 jammed a malarial hell, infested with lice and maggots, suffering from smallpox and dysentery, typhus, and other god-awful maladies. One doctor wrote, "We had nothing to give them. It broke my heart, and I wept until I had not more power to weep." And we see Matthew Patton of Bedford, New Hampshire, whose son John had survived a gunshot wound to the arm at Bunker Hill, but did not survive Île aux Noix. Mr. Patton wrote simply in his diary, "I got an account of my John's death of the smallpox at Canada. He was 24 years and 31 days old." And of course, entire towns are obliterated during the fighting. You may know that during the British assault on Bunker Hill, which was actually Breed's Hill, in June of 1775, the decision was made by the British High Command to bombard Charlestown, which abuts the battlefield there, because American snipers were firing at them into the flanks of the King's regiments. Royal Navy warships will conduct the bombardment from the Charles River, along with 24-pounder field guns set on high ground in Boston, where General John Burgoyne has taken his post. And the shells they fire include carcasses, each packed with gunpowder, Swedish pitch, saltpeter, and tallow. And the Charlestown Meeting House, with its slender, towering steeple, is identified as a conspicuous aiming stake. Here's my brief account of what happens next. The first shell fell short, bursting near the ferry slip. Gunners corrected their elevation, and within minutes, the hole was instantly in flames, as Burgoyne would write. Fire loped through Charlestown streets like a thing alive, igniting buildings at the foot of Chestnut Street and around Malden Shipyard. Other structures along the docks followed in quick succession: distilleries, a tannery, warehouses, shipwrights, a cooperage. Fire climbed the pitch roofs, a grand and melancholy sight, one loyalist observed, then licked through houses away from the waterfront and up to the marketplace, incinerating the courthouse and the Three Cranes Tavern. North of the market, on Town Hill, more houses and another distillery caught fire. The light breeze shifted from southwest to east, as it often did on fine summer days, and flames drove lengthwise through Charlestown. Fire ignited more wharves and a ship chandlery. Ebony smoke rose in a column wide as the town, then hung like a thundercloud over the contending armies, an American officer reported. Rebel musketmen scurried from the burning buildings to hide behind stone walls on Breed's Hill and in a nearby barn. The church steeples, being made of timber, were great pyramids of fire above the rest, wrote Burgoyne, who had a way with words. The roar of cannon, mortars, musketry, the crash of churches, ships upon the stocks, the whole streets falling together in ruin to fill the ear. All in all, he added, the conflagration was one of the greatest scenes of war that can be imagined. Gawkers and gapers climbed not only Boston rooftops and hillsides, but the masts of ships in the harbor. Loyalists and patriots perched together, mesmerized by the sight of a town immolated. Here, once again, was an ancient, squalid secret. That war was an enchantment, a sorcery, a seductive spectacle like no other, beguiling the eye and gorging the senses. They looked because they could not look away. Some 232 houses in Charlestown, more than 300 other structures were incinerated. And that episode foreshadows other incinerated towns, like Falmouth on the coast of Maine and Norfolk. The historian Bruce Catton considered the American Civil War a redemptive tragedy. And surely the same can be said of the American Revolution. It embodied the enduring aspirations of an idealistic people and brought forth a nation abounding with a sense of destiny. No wonder the world was agog. The cause of America, wrote the essayist Thomas Paine, is the cause of all mankind. Even now, the war for independence offers clues to our national temperament. It remains a bright mirror in which to see traits that fashion the American temperament, the American character, from ingenuity and resilience to brutality and pugnacity. We've come far in almost 2.5 centuries in power, diversity, tolerance, and sheer scale. But in some respects, those ancestors remain nearer than we know. Their existential struggle churned up issues that perplex us to this day, including individual liberty versus collective security, the proper limits on executive power, the obligations of citizenship, and the elusive quest for a more equitable society. The tacit primal question of 1776 remains valid in 2019. Who do we want to be? Democracy is never a thing done, the poet and Librarian of Congress Archibald MacLeish told us. Democracy is always something a nation must be doing. Even Jefferson's Declaration, our foundational secular scripture, we hold these truths to be self-evident, is something never done. It's something a nation must be doing. The great Yale historian Edmund Morgan wrote that the creed of equality did not give men and women equality, but invited them to claim it, invited them not to know their place and keep it, but to seek and demand a better place. The American Revolution lasted 3,089 days, and the result was epical and enduring, the creation of the American Republic, one of mankind's greatest achievements. Nearly 90,000 more days have elapsed since those horsefly swatting men in Philadelphia asserted a birthright of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Keeping faith with those who fought, suffered, and died for the principles we profess to still cherish requires more than a nodding acquaintance with them, more than a perfunctory acknowledgement of their struggles. For better and for worse, their story is our story. Their fight remains our fight. Thanks again for having me here at Cantigny tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for that.
All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and answer some questions now. As a reminder, if you have a question, please remember to raise your hand, and also please wait for the microphone before you ask your questions so that everybody, including our viewers online, will be able to hear as well.
It's great to have you back. It's good to see you again, and
Sure,
it's a
thank
great
you.
read. When you were looking at King George's paperwork and looking at the information he was getting back from the royal governors and the agents in North America, were they painting a rosy picture or were they accurate?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it goes to the heart of the misconceptions that George and his ministers and really the whole country, including Parliament, embraced. It's important to know, first of all, that George, king for 60 years, never traveled beyond England in his whole life, never even went to Scotland. None of his ministers, Lord North, who was his first minister, prime minister we call him today, Lord Sandwich, who was the head of the Admiralty, none of them had been to America. So they really don't have an understanding of what the place is firsthand. And they are reliant on reports from the royal governors. Now, by 1776, I think it's 6 of those governors are living on ships offshore from their colonies because they have been evicted from their capitals. That includes the governor of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. The only one who's still in his capital then is William Franklin, Ben Franklin's son, who is the royal governor of New Jersey, in part thanks to his father's pull, and remains loyal, and he soon will be in prison. So the king and his cabinet and the parliament are relying on reports from particularly those governors, but from other sources too, including various loyalist worthies. Those reports tend to be distorted. They're distorted in part because if you're living on a ship off the coast of Charleston, you don't know what's happening in the low country of South Carolina, much less what's happening in the interior. The same is true in most of the southern colonies, and most of the northern colonies, the governors have been long gone. And if you're a loyalist, you want the king to believe that there is a large residual force of loyalists just waiting to emerge from the woodworks to come out as soon as a few redcoats show up, to show their loyalty and to rally to the king's cause. Because you're in danger of losing everything you've got otherwise. And so there is a very distorted view in London as a consequence of this errant reporting, this biased reporting, that affects British decision-making before the Revolution, at the beginning of the Revolution, and virtually to the end of the Revolution. And the last thing I'll say about it is, if you're lucky, traveling from London to, say, New York, you can do it in 2 months. If you're not lucky, it could take you 6 months. If you're going the other way, with the wind at your back, typically going west to east, you can maybe make it in a month, sometimes longer. That is not a recipe for good, timely decision-making. And it comes into play over and over again where the king, Lord North, Parliament, both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, who remain ardent for the cause virtually to the end of the war, they are making decisions that are based on faulty, untimely information. Because it can be weeks or months after events have overtaken the decisions that you've made and the orders that you've issued. So that's a very good question.
We have another question over here.
Thank you. You're an amazing speaker, so I appreciate it very much. what kind of foil would you say France provided this Revolutionary War in getting our country going, I guess you'd call it?
Yeah. Well, there's no victory without France. The revolution is the first critical lesson to all of us that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without allies. And France is our first most critical ally. France wants nothing more than to stick it to the British in retaliation for the humiliation they have endured at the end of the 7 Years' War. It's been a humiliating defeat. Britain has been obnoxious as a victor of that war. And everyone from King Louis the 16th, who is young and relatively new to the throne, to Charles Vergennes, who's his foreign minister, and on down throughout France, all they want to do is stick it to the British. And the best way, they conclude, to do that is to support the Americans and to make this war drag out and ultimately to cause Britain to be defeated and to have Britain's empire begin to crumble at the edges, at least, if not thoroughly. There are trade reasons involved. France and Britain are both competing for the sugar islands in the West Indies. That's where the real money is. They don't really care about North America. The real money is in sugar in the West Indies. So France initially is providing clandestine aid. And there's a playwright named Beaumarchais in Paris. You could not invent him. He's such a wonderful character. He wrote The Marriage of Figaro, among other things. He's a wonderful character, and he wields great influence, and he is persuading the king and the king's ministers that, in fact, the American cause is not only righteous in and of itself, although the king, who's an absolute monarch, is thinking, why would I support rebellion against a monarch? Well, his inclination to do whatever it takes to cause pain to Britain overcomes those scruples. And so they're initially providing clandestine aid. They are secretly shipping weapons. The weapons that first arrive in early 1777 are used in some cases at the Battle of Saratoga, which was a stunning defeat for the British in New York in the early fall of 1777. They're providing money, because we got no money. And then after the Battle of Saratoga, the French are persuaded to come in overtly. They basically declare war against Britain. Spain, their sister Bourbon power, also comes into the war against Britain. The Dutch will come in. Britain has no friends, incidentally. They have alienated all of Europe as a consequence of the 7 Years' War. And they're going to be fighting alone. And they're going to fight a losing war. And so when we're sticking a thumb in the eye to our allies today, whether it's the Kurds or our closer allies, the Brits, the French, the Canadians, the Australians, it's good to remember that allies are really important, whether it's the 18th century or the 21st century. That French help, they will send a fleet initially in 1778. Then they will send another fleet that is going to end up winning the war at Yorktown for us. They will send an army under Rochambeau, and that is the decisive sequence of events and assistance that will cause the war to be won in 1781. The French are the critical ingredient, as it turns out.
All right, we have another question over here.
First, thank you for the clarity of your presentation. I've sat through innumerable historical lectures back in the 70s, especially about this period, and come away more confused than I ever wanted to be.
I can confuse you, don't worry.
My question is a little bit more all-encompassing in that the 7 Years' War, and you touched on this a little bit, is really the first world war. in a lot of ways, and you're discussing this in relation to the various allies that we ended up with. But how is the revolution an outgrowth of that victory by Britain? I guess that's...
Yeah. Yeah, it's complex in the same way that World War I is often seen as an antecedent to World War II. There's unfinished business as a consequence of World War I and Germany's defeat in World War I and the hard peace that's imposed on them, and German resentment and the use that Hitler and other fascists put to the German defeat in their own rise to power. It doesn't play out obviously in the same way in the 18th century, but the defeat of France and Spain, as I mentioned, causes great resentment. It causes the British to have a sense of omnipotence, a sense of entitlement, a sense that, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And they are ascendant. And they're ascendant not just because they've won that war. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution is starting in earnest in the 1770s in Britain. The steam engine, the cotton gin, they are really coming to the fore. There are 11 million Brits. It's still a country with a lot of domestic problems. They've got the Irish problem eternally. But they are 11 million of them, and they're increasingly prosperous. They believe, partly as a consequence of their victory in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, that the cornerstone of their prosperity and their success is their colonies. Colonies exist in the British imperial point of view to provide raw materials to the mother country and to buy finished goods from the mother country. Full stop. The colonies do not exist to participate in democracy. They do not exist to have a voice in the deliberations of Parliament. They do not exist in any way other than for the greater glory of the British Empire, and you should be damned happy to have it. That's how they feel about it. They believe that the Americans and the American rebelliousness that is asserting itself very early after the 1763 victory, rebellion against the Stamp Act in 1765, such a fierce rebellion against it that the Stamp Act was repealed. And the British attitude toward the Americans is basically, well, you ungrateful children. They use that metaphor of ungrateful children over and over again. And so there are a lot of tendrils that come out of the 7 Years' War that are going to lead to trouble. And part of it is British overreaching, part of it is Americans feeling muscle, part of it is the French threat has been removed. We're accustomed, if you're a New Englander, to 150 years of French and Indian raids along the frontier. Terrible raids, scalping, murder, rape, kidnapping. If you're a New Englander, you hate the French, and you hate what the French have been. Well, the French are gone. 1763, Canada belongs to Britain. They're still habitants, they're French Canadians, but they're controlled by Britain. So that leaves the New Englanders especially, and Americans generally feeling, well, we don't need the Brits to protect us anymore from those guys, and we're doing all right ourselves anyway. And that's also an ingredient in what's going to happen in the 1770s.
All right, our next question is up front here.
Thank you, Rick. I'm a big fan. I've read all your books, and when I was reading the latest one, you referred to it earlier, the mistake that Nathaniel Greene made. And as I was reading about Fort Washington, I kept saying, why aren't they getting out of there? Why did he make that decision to make a stand there when Washington was retreating as he had been for a while. It just didn't make sense in their head. I don't know if I got a reason out of the book, but maybe it's there, but I don't recall it. Oh, and by the way, don't take 10 years to write the next 2 books, please.
No promises there. And she back there has had a question, so if you can pass the mic to her. Well, I hope the explanation is in the book. Fort Washington was a badly conceived fort overlooking the Hudson River. It's up beyond where Harlem is today. And the belief was that even though the British had taken all of the southern and central part of Manhattan Island, that this was kind of an impregnable redoubt. Now, Nathaniel Greene is just a fascinating character. I mentioned Quaker Anchorsmith from Rhode Island. He had run for lieutenancy in a company from his town in Rhode Island, and his company mates, he had an odd gait. He had a little bit of a limp, and his fellow company mates said, "You'd look funny walking at the head of the company. We're not going to elect you." So he's a private. The Rhode Island General Assembly, the Greene family had some political pull. They made him a brigadier general. So he went from private to brigadier general overnight. When Washington shows up to command the Continental Army on July 2nd, 1775, there's this guy Greene as a brigadier general, head of the Rhode Island troops that are in Cambridge as part of the siege force in Boston. And Washington has one of his many fine attributes as an executive, with a brain built for executive action, is extremely good at spotting subordinate talent. He has seen, for example, a 25-year-old overweight Boston bookseller named Henry Knox, and somehow recognized that Henry Knox can be the father of American artillery. And he sees in Greene something. And he trusts him, he relies on him, and he relies on him too much early on, because Greene, like most of them, really has very little experience. Yeah, you can make him a general, but that doesn't mean he is a general. And so he reads the terrain wrong. He reads the circumstances wrong. Washington relies on him too much. Now, Washington has been near Fort Washington. He's been in New Jersey across the river for several days, looking at the situation. He's on the scene. When I said he knows how to prevaricate, he prevaricates about his responsibility for what happens at Fort Washington. He lets Greene take the spear in the chest, really. But they believe that because they've got the high ground, because they've got artillery, because they've got a potential escape route across the Hudson, you go down the steep embankment and you can be rowed across the river to escape in New Jersey, that it's going to be basically impregnable. Well, it falls in 8 hours. It's just a terrible misreading. And Greene, he writes to his friend, Henry Knox. He said, if I ever needed a friend, I need one now. He's suffering. He's in agony. By the way, those 3,000 Americans who are captured there, most of them die in British captivity. We would consider the way Americans were treated in British prisons, particularly on the prison ships that were anchored in the East River, to be war crimes. The treatment was so barbaric. And so this is not just guys going into captivity for a while until they're exchanged or until the war ends. This is guys going off to their deaths. So there are other mistakes like that. Washington has made a similar mistake on Long Island. This guy's a surveyor. He's supposed to know, he's supposed to be able to read the land well. He goes over, he looks around, and he says, "Oh, this looks good to me." They're outflanked immediately, and the army is routed. There's a steep learning curve for all of them. And Fort Washington is one of the most painful of those things. Now, the last thing I will say is Greene, like Washington, they learn from their mistakes. They're really adaptable, sign of a fine military leader. And Washington, even though he lets Greene take primary responsibility for it, doesn't throw him over the side. He recognizes that this is a guy he's going to need. Greene is going to command the American force for the last 2 years of the war, where the war is fought in the South. It's going to be Greene who's the guy who's in charge. Greene will, in effect, win the war by fine generalship in those last couple of years. So, yeah, your question is right. What are they thinking? What are they thinking? Well, we can say that through military history over and over again, and that's one of those instances. Yes, ma'am.
So I know that the French helped the colonists to fight the British, and we won. And shortly thereafter, the French had their own Revolutionary War. And my question is, since the United States was born, we have had American citizens asking each other, should we get involved in other countries' affairs? Even no matter how dire or how huge they are, there was question about whether we should be involved in either of the world wars and so forth. And so my question is, was it the same in France in those days? Were the citizens angry that France had put some of their people to death getting involved in America's war? And was that one of the reasons that they overthrew their monarchy, or had the monarchy screwed up so much that it really made no difference whatsoever and they would have led them to the guillotine either way?
Yeah, well, and I'm not an expert on the French Revolution, but one of the ironies of French assistance to the Americans in the war is that it helped to bankrupt France. Now, they achieved their objective in causing pain to Britain. And the British Empire will shrink by about a third as a consequence of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. They will lose their colonies here. They will pay for it in various ways to both the French and the Spanish. But the French have, they've spent so much on this assistance that they are really in financially rocky territory. And this will come back to haunt them. There's not resentment against the assistance that's given to the Americans per se, which is hugely popular in France. The Lafayettes of the world, Lafayette is a 19-year-old nobleman, one of the richest men in France. He disobeys the king and slips out of France and shows up initially in South Carolina, and he's going to join Washington, and he's going to be here as an important contributor. There are many French and other European officers who show up looking for glory and high rank in America. Most of them are worthless, and it's a big problem for Washington and others. Lafayette is one of the singular exceptions to that. Lafayette is a national hero in France. The cause of America is the cause not only of all mankind, as Thomas Paine told us, it's the cause of France. They really like the idea that Enlightenment ideals are playing out in America in a tangible way. This is a tricky thing for an absolute monarch. What's going to happen in the 1780s and when the French Revolution begins is the monarchy, which is really rotten from within. And the ancient regime of France is teetering. It's a revolution for different reasons than there's a revolution here. It's an internal revolution. It's obviously, they take a different route. There's terrorism of the first order where people are marched to the guillotine by the hundreds. The terror is really horrible. It's something we avoided, they didn't avoid. So there are a lot of reasons for what happened in France, and of course it gives rise to Napoleon. It also gives rise to a second British Empire. The British Empire is going to be reborn. It's going to be bigger and badder than ever before, more widespread, more prosperous. But the French role in America is kind of tangential, except for the fact that it has cost them dearly financially. to what's happening internally in France.
All right, we're going to have to start wrapping it up due to time. So Jackie, if you can grab one more question on that side, please. And I apologize for not everybody who got their questions asked this evening, but we do have to start wrapping up.
I was wondering, since our Bill of Rights is based a lot on how Britain treated, especially the soldiers, treated Americans at the time, what was the timeline of that type of treatment? Was it that did the British treat the American colonists like that, like from the very first? Or was it because the Americans were starting to get belligerent and stuff that, you know, things like that started to happen from the British soldiers?
Well, it's a complex issue, as you might imagine, and there's no uniform treatment of Americans by the British. In some cases, the British and the Americans have gotten along famously. There's intermarriage, there are deep friendships. The Loyalists obviously feel a clear affinity for the Crown and for the King's Army and the Royal Navy. One of the first sticking points is when British troops show up as an occupation force in Boston. After the French and Indian War ends, and the British now they've gained Canada, they've gained some of those sugar islands, they've gained 500 million fertile acres west of the Appalachians. And they leave troops here. It's not a huge force, but they leave several regiments of troops here in order to preserve peace on the frontier between the Americans and the Indians. And they also issue edicts that the Americans are not to move west of the Appalachians, basically, in settlement. That outrages the George Washingtons of the world, who've got money invested in Ohio expansion plans and so on. Some of those troops end up going to Boston because the Bostonians have been, fractious and difficult. And so you have a couple regiments in Boston, and that inevitably leads to frictions. It leads in 1770 to the Boston Massacre. There's a minor riot. British soldiers open fire. 5 Bostonians are killed. They remember that in Boston. Every year on the anniversary of the massacre, they have an oration, and thousands of people come to it to hear a commemoration of those who died at British hands. There are efforts at taxation because the British have spent so much money, they're close to bankruptcy as a consequence of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. They decide, hey, look, we got rid of that French problem for you guys in America. We're protecting your trade routes with the Royal Navy. We're doing all kinds of things to help you to prosper. By the way, the growth rate in America in the 1770s, population increase, is unlike anything ever imagined in Britain. It's 4 times the growth rate of Britain. It's greater than any country in Europe has ever seen, by far. So we are reproducing very quickly. Benjamin Franklin is keenly aware of this and throws it in the face of the British all the time. And so the British impose taxes. They're relatively minor, but they're an annoyance, and we have no voice in it. I live in the District of Columbia, and my license plate says no taxation without representation. Why is that? Because I live in the last colony. I have no representation in Congress as a resident of the District of Columbia. Pisses me off. And it pissed them off that taxes were imposed on them without their having a voice in that decision-making process. The British were surprised at the violent reaction to the Stamp Act and other taxes that were imposed, and they repealed those acts. They end up keeping a small tax, it's very small, it's 3 pence a pound, on tea. not because it's going to be a big moneymaker, but because the principle of parliamentary control, parliamentary ability to tax the colonies is a principle that they believe needs to be upheld. Well, you know what happens. The tea shows up in Boston, tea goes into the harbor, and that is really the straw that breaks the camel's back. That's December of 1773. The king is so outraged, he's sputtering with anger about it. And at that point, it's a spiraling decline to violence, to revolution, to war. So, you know, you have these clattering consequences that persist over the course of a decade. And it starts really with the fact that these are two peoples that have grown apart and don't really understand each other especially well anymore, and don't really belong together. And no one, the last thing I'll say is, no one in the 1770s has the wit at the time, there's no reason that they necessarily should, to come up with the idea of a commonwealth, which is what the British eventually forged. An affiliation of countries that have a common heritage. They're independent, their sovereignty is independent, and yet they've got an affiliation, a political affiliation like the British Commonwealth. So Australia, Canada, they're not part of the British Empire. There is no British Empire. It is diminishing by the day. But they have a residual linkage through the Commonwealth. Nobody had that. Nobody came up with that idea in the 1770s. If they had, maybe there was a way to resolve the issues that led to bloodshed and complete separation, but that didn't happen. Thanks again so much for having me here tonight. Thank you.